text on Tuesday, the May 2020 Torah Roundup. I used a theme in PowerPoint that made it seem like a show. This is supposed to be, you know, like a ticket to the show. I don't know how much of a show it's going to be, but we'll give it a shot. So the basic idea is summarize what's in the Torah portions from the traditional reading cycle, hit on important features. Sometimes it's historically, sometimes it's textually, sometimes it's practically in the individual Torah portions, and kind of exploring the Haftarot, the prophetic readings that get tied to the Torah portions. So on a Saturday morning, the entire Torah portion will be read, and then someone will also read the Haftarah. There are lots of explanations for how we got the Haftarah in general. I don't know that any of them are historically reliable, so I'm not going to tell you that any of them is the right answer. The traditional answer tends to be, well, there was a period where Jews were being persecuted for reading the Torah, so they decided to game the system, and they gamed the system by reading from the prophets, and people were none the wiser. I don't really think that that is how it worked, really. But much of traditional Judaism just doesn't read the prophetic literature very much, and this is a way of adding prophetic literature in. I think that's probably the most accurate statement that we can really go with. So I'll use Hebrew words that I want to make sure everybody's aware of. Sometimes I use them in the slides, but I won't say them. Sometimes I'll say them, but they won't be in the slides, so it's useful to know. So a parashah is 1 week's set of Torah readings. Ashkenazic Jews often say parsha instead of parashah, but the proper Hebrew is parashah. Ashkenazim shove the stress all the way at the beginning because that's what you do with German a lot of the time, so that's what you do with Yiddish, so you'll hear a lot of people say parsha. I will probably say parsha a lot. Parshiot is the plural of parashah. Most people say parshiot, or in the yeshiva world, parshius, as you turn the S into, you know, the T into an S, and you get an oi and all sorts of other things. The Parshat HaShavua is the parashah of the week. Haftarah is the reading from the prophetic literature. It is not related to the word Torah. So sometimes people will say Haftarah, like it's a half of a Torah or something. Haftarah is a totally different root from the word Torah. Haftarah literally means to dismiss in Mishnaic Hebrew, and Hebrew from the time that this term came up, and the idea was that you read the Torah portion, you read the Haftarah, and then you dismissed everybody. And that was the end of the service. And an aliyah literally means ascent, right? So people make aliyah to Israel. Well, you make aliyah when you have an aliyah when you go up to the Torah. Each parsha is divided into sets of aliyot, that's the plural. So Shabbat morning, traditionally the whole Torah portion for the week is read, unless you're on a triennial cycle. We won't go down that road. But then on Monday morning, Thursday morning, and Saturday afternoon, you kind of get an abbreviated set of just 3 readings. Every individual aliyah is really supposed to be a minimum of 3 verses. Almost all of them are at minimum of 3 verses. During the week, they're very, very short. On Shabbat, it's the whole thing. So I'll be using all these terms as we go, so it's helpful to have kind of the glossary up front. Let's see. So we actually have 4 to 5 Torah portions to review, depending on how far we get and how you want to divide things up. Each week usually has its own assigned Torah reading. So May 2nd has these 2, May 9 has this, May 16 has this one, May 23rd has this one. This is one of those months where there are 5 Saturdays, and so in theory there are 5 Torah portions for the month. But because Shavuot happens on Thursday, Shavuot day 2 is Friday through Saturday on the traditional diaspora calendar, so your Torah reading is a little bit different. You don't get the one that would have been regularly scheduled, you get the readings for Shavuot. And the readings for Shavuot are a little bit repetitive. You add some stuff in for the first day that wouldn't be there otherwise. So we'll talk about even how the Torah portions get their names, because the names of things don't necessarily tell you anything about the content, but it's how people know what parashah you're in, what parsha you're in. Okay, and I have the biblical reference so you know what chapters and verses things cover. So Achrei Mot Kedoshim is the first one for May. It was May 2nd is when it was read, and it is basically 4 or 5 chapters of Leviticus, right? 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 5 chapters of Leviticus. This is in the area of things where if this is your B mitzvah, you're not necessarily terribly happy you got some of these Torah portions. Achrei Mot Kedoshim is not the worst. That's definitely Mitzorah or something like that from a couple of weeks ago, from about a little over a month ago, where you're talking about leprosy. That's definitely like you've pulled the shortest straw. This is not as short a straw. So Achrei Mot Kedoshim is actually 2 parshiot combined. So it's a combination of Achrei Mot and Kedoshim. So each of them is actually shorter than the whole thing put together, and they're doubled up because this year is not a leap year in the Jewish calendar. So leap years in the Jewish calendar, not the same as leap years in our calendar in kind of modern America. When you have a leap year in the Jewish calendar, you actually add in a month because you have to adjust for this lunar cycle that gets a little bit out of whack, right? The solar cycle gets out of whack by about a day every 4 years. The Jewish calendar would get 8 to 9 months out of whack over the course of an 18-year period. So you have these leap years thrown in, and adding that extra day in is called intercalation, throwing something into the calendar. And what the month that gets doubled is the month of Adar. So the month that Purim occurs in, there's an Adar 1 and an Adar 2. During non-leap years, you have to combine Torah portions to read the whole thing in one go through the year. So you get Achrei Mot and Kedoshim combined. There's actually this page from the University of Toronto website talks about how you figure out the leap years. It used to be done based on lunar observation, and that was true until around 1000 CE, and then they kind of switched over to calculation of it. So this website is actually, if you read it at the beginning, he says this is intended for people who are writing software to deal with the Jewish calendar. So it goes into a lot of details, but it also has a table that tells you which Torah portions are the ones that get glued together, because it's a set of a very limited set of about 16 Torah portions that you can do this with. You can't do this with every Torah portion. So it gets determined in advance based on when is the next holiday coming up. Shavuot's coming up next. Well, we have to combine Achrei Mot and Kedoshim. You know, that's kind of how they make these determinations. Why Adar? Because Adar is the last month of the biblical Jewish calendar. So we're used to Rosh Hashanah being the beginning of the Jewish year. It's one beginning of multiple optional Jewish years. It occurs in the fall, but that's not when the biblical calendar began. The biblical calendar began in spring, in the same month that Passover happens. That's the first month for purposes of some of these calculations. So to make it work, we get an extra Adar. It's particularly helpful because Adar doesn't have a lot of holidays, so you're not risking doubling any major holidays by doing this. So we get the name of the parashah from it being doubled up, and then each of the parshiot gets a name from something in the text early on in the Hebrew. So the Achremot half receives its name from the 5th and 6th words. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe Achremot, Shnei b'nei Aharon, spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron. So that's where we're getting Achremot from. In Kedoshim, Vayidaber el Moshe lemor, Daber el kol adat b'nei Yisrael va'amarta alehem kedoshim tihu. It's called Kedoshim because there is absolutely nothing until you get to that word that makes this formulaic phrase any different from the ones that appear lots and lots and lots of other places in the Torah. So if you tried to have a parsha called Parsha Vayidaber, okay, which verse does that start on? Because there are huge chunks of Leviticus that start Vayidaber al Moshe, blah, 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 blah. So you wouldn't have any way of finding it. So this is the first time you get a distinctive word is Kedoshim, and that's how we get the name of this Torah portion. And it's speak to the entire congregation of the children in Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, holy here, Kedoshim. So that's how we get the name of these parshiot. Why combine them? Thematically, they're similar. Where they fall out in the calendar in a year where Shavuot happens, where it happens here, makes them work together. And they actually put together a set of rules that are a little bit duplicate. We'll see, they're kind of duplicative, but they're all actually kind of a literary unit. So this makes sense looking on top of it. Achremot starts with one of the versions for Yom Kippur. And when you read it, you don't necessarily know at first that they're talking about Yom Kippur because it describes all of this stuff about the scapegoat, right? We have one goat that you sacrifice and one goat that gets sent into the desert to Azazel. And it's only when you're like 20 verses into this chapter that you realize it's talking about Yom Kippur because it finally tells you, you'll do this once a year on Yom Kippur. And you go, oh, okay. Otherwise, you read this thing and you think, oh, we're supposed to do this all the time? They weren't doing it all the time. They were doing it once a year. So Achremot is chapters 16 and 17. And when you grab chapter 17 and you pull it all the way to Leviticus chapter 26, you have a unit of text called the Holiness Code. The Holiness Code is thought by biblical scholars, modern biblical scholars, to be its own subtext, not a subtext, its own subtext, its own set of sources that were written separately from the other laws in Leviticus and have a different focus. So all the laws in Leviticus have some kind of focus on purity and making Israel somehow distinct. What makes the Holiness Code different is that it's focused on making everybody holy from the biblical perspective instead of just the priests. So its rationale for all of these rules is you should be a holy people, as opposed to don't do things like all the other people do, and also the priests need to be holy in order to do this stuff. So it's a different set of rationales, which is part of how scholars kind of figured out that maybe this is its own thing. They also think that most scholars think that it's older than the rest of Leviticus. So they would say, well, this is probably the 7th century, so the 600s, or maybe the 6th century, the 500s, but probably the 7th century, the 600s, because it's less focused on the priests. And the priests, as a professional class, are somewhat less important before the Babylonian exile because people are still worshiping at local sites and the idea of a single cult is not fully taken hold yet. So focusing on everybody being holy is more useful. It's also more useful because this would have originated right around the time that the northern kingdom, which was called the Kingdom of Israel, that the northern kingdom would have been destroyed and people were taken into exile by the Assyrians, never to be seen again. So the people who were left had to be kind of brought into the fold. And you do that by saying, okay, everybody has to do this stuff. Not everybody has to follow these guys, but everybody has to do this stuff. So that's part of the rationale for saying, okay, this chunk of stuff, this is older. Which means that all the other stuff in Leviticus on this particular kind of theory dates to after the Babylonian exile. So after 586 BCE, in the Second Temple period. So the Holiness Code, we talked about Leviticus 16, which is not part of the Holiness Code, that basically is all the rules for how to do Yom Kippur, one of the set of all the rules. There's multiple sets of rules. So if you look at the Holiness Code, chapter 17 is part of Achremot, and it talks about what you do when someone sacrifices an animal without bringing it to the tabernacle. So there was some idea that you weren't allowed to eat meat unless you shared with the priests who don't own land, don't grow crops. They need your donations to survive. This is starting to sound like a high holidays appeal. It's not too different. What to do when someone sacrifices an animal someplace else. Okay, you have this animal and you sacrificed it outside the camp. Also bad. What to do when somebody consumes blood. We know from Genesis with Noah that you're not supposed to consume blood. That's bad. That's why kosher meat is always so darn salty when you buy it. And what to do when someone eats an animal that kind of like died on its own. You find an animal dead and somebody eats some of it. That's bad from Leviticus's perspective. It's probably just bad today too. You don't really want to like take that risk. So what do you do about it? Because you're supposed to not eat animal meat that's not from an intact animal on this book's definition of what intact means. And the idea is when you break any of these rules, you're actually endangering all the Israelites. Nobody is pure if somebody is impure. So you have to do stuff to fix it. Maybe you kick the person out, maybe there's a sacrifice or something like that. Chapter 18, the next one, basically starts with okay, don't behave like the Canaanites. I'm bringing you into this land, don't do what they do. And then it goes through a list of sexual relationships you can't engage in because you're not supposed to defile yourself. So this is where we would have stopped if this were just Achremot, but we have Kedoshim as well. Kedoshim lists a bunch of ethical rules. How you cultivate crops, how much you have to leave in the corners, what kinds of weights and measures you have to have, whether you can crossbreed animals, whether you can crossbreed plants, rules for interpersonal relationships, not sexual relationships, but just how do you treat your neighbor? With the rationale for all of these rules being you have to be holy. Everybody has to be holy, and this is how you do it. And then Kedoshim has a bunch more ethical rules, and it restates some of the sexual rules that were in, this should say chapter 18. It restates some of the stuff that was in chapter 18 with differences. And the differences are the source of a lot of discussion in modern Jewish ethics about what does this say about same-gender relationships. So there are differences, and one of the big differences is that there are instructions on clean versus unclean animals, what you can and what you can't eat. There's rationale and consequences, and then there's this like throwaway verse that says, oh, people who have familiar spirits should be thrown out of the camp. It's not obvious what this means, but witchcraft is always bad from the Bible's perspective, so no witchcraft. And that's kind of how this chapter wraps up. Is don't do witchcraft. So one of the big sets of differences is in chapter 18, it doesn't mention thou shalt not lie with a man as thou lies with a woman. Chapter 20 has it. And so there's some thought that maybe these two texts are trying to do something different. I'm not persuaded. I think we just have multiple statements of some rules, and one of them included something that one of them didn't. There's lots of efforts to say, oh, this means something, that they're separate, but the end document still kind of comes out and says, we don't like sexual relationships between two men. It's really all the text says. It then is interpreted later on to say, oh, all same gender relationships are bad. So the Haftarot for Ashkenazim is Amos chapter 9, verses 7 to 15. For Sephardim, it's Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 2 through 20. It is not every Torah portion, not every parsha has a different Haftarah depending on whether the community reading it follows Ashkenazic rules or Sephardic rules. But this is one that does, because different communities found different links to things in the prophetic literature, and this is one of those times where there were different links seen. So Amos 9, 7 through 15 is hooking onto something that is in the Holiness Code in Leviticus 20, where it says, okay, the rationale for doing this is you're supposed to be holy, and here's what's going to happen to you if you don't do it. I will displace you from the land that I've displaced somebody else from. You will be spit out by the land. So this is Amos saying, oh, you've been spit out by the land, or you will be soon, but it's not permanent, because don't worry, you'll go back. So there's this tension that exists in the prophets between foretelling bad things happening to you and foretelling Israel coming back from whatever the bad thing is. So this is the tie, is there's some kind of consolation for being ejected. Ezekiel 20 is locking onto some of the same themes. So I warn the children in the wilderness, don't follow the practices of your fathers, don't keep their ways, don't defile yourselves with their fetishes. This is the Jewish Publication Society translation. I don't know what to tell you about that particular word choice, but they went with what they went with. But it says, okay, it's connecting into some of the same things. Don't be like your ancestors who did bad stuff in the wilderness. Ezekiel, we're gonna see, is an interesting character because he's a priest, and he has some rules that he sets out that don't match up with what's in Leviticus. So that's its own thing. But here he's latched onto the idea that, okay, don't do the bad stuff that your ancestors did, and that'll allow you to come back into the land. So Ezekiel is the prophet of the Babylonian exile in a lot of ways. Okay, so that's Achrimot and Kedoshim. I wish I could tell you that I thought it was a super, super interesting Torah portion. This week, I don't think so. Probably because I already said something about it 4 or 5 weeks ago in an email, and now I don't remember what I said, and it was interesting then, now it's not. Because I burned out on Achrimot Kedoshim 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago. Okay. So the next one is Emor. We're still in Leviticus. I don't know what to tell you. And when we get to Numbers, it's not all that interesting. So we're really sort of stuck in this. We're stuck in this section of the Bible that when people tell you they've read the whole Bible, you know they're lying. Because nobody reads this stuff if you don't have to. So the name of the Parsha, it's the 5th word in Hebrew. Emor, El HaKohanim, speak to the priests. So this is one of those times, and more isn't all that uncommon a word, but it's fairly uncommon in this context, so it's not hard to figure it out, which is how we get this. Otherwise, you're looking for a more distinct Hebrew word. And more continues the holiness code. We will be dealing with the holiness code all the way through the end of Leviticus, which fortunately for you is only one more Torah portion after this. So the holiness code continues. It has rules for how the priest should live, including mourning practices. What do you do when somebody dies? Can you come in contact with a dead body when you are one of the priests? What kinds of marriages can you have? What happens? I said the consequences for sins of priests' children, but it's a very specific sin. What happens when a priest has a daughter who becomes a prostitute? And it's likely that we're not talking about general run-of-the-mill prostitution, but what happens if a priest has a daughter who engages in some sort of sacred prostitution, which was not uncommon in the ancient Near East, but seems to be very uncommon for Israelites. And then specific purity rules, there's a bunch of other stuff there. If you've touched a dead body, here's what you have to do. If you come in contact with this thing, here's what you have to do. What condition sacrificial animals must be in. You can see how this is a riveting section of the Torah for a lot of people. But it also gives us like our first full Jewish calendar. So it lists Shabbat, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuot. It's not called Rosh Hashanah yet, but it's Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And those are actually the holidays that would have existed in the biblical period. Purim, later. Hanukkah, later. Tisha B'Av, not yet. So the holidays that Tu B'Shvat isn't really a holiday yet. Tu B'Shvat is just a tax day. Rosh Hashanah HaBehemot, for those who are aware of it, just a tax day. So this is our first calendar, and includes some of the rules for leaving the corners of your field unharvested so that poor people have something to eat. So this chunk is actually pretty important and useful. How to prepare oil and bread offerings, which is not very useful to us today, but having the word challah that we use for, braided bread actually is used in the Tanakh. It's used right here in the Holiness Code to talk about offerings of bread that were just kind of part of the daily sacrificial routine. And they were cakes of some kind that had oil poured on them. So this is challah, though not as we know it. And then there's a dispute that starts, a dispute between two people that turns into blasphemy. And this is where we learn that you stone people who commit blasphemy to death, even if maybe they're not really fully Israelite, which I did talk about in an email. So we can look back at that email because it's interesting for this. But this is all, again, holiness code stuff that we're worried about everybody doing because it does bad stuff to all Israelites, not just pertaining to the priests. When the priests mess something up, it puts everybody in danger, is the idea. This is one of the sources for you can't get married, you can't get married, shouldn't get married in a cemetery. This is one of the sources for you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery if you have a tattoo. So we have all of this. What do Kohanim do when somebody dies, right? This is mourning practices. And one of them is don't shave and don't make gashes in your flesh. So you're not supposed to scar yourself. And it was very common in the ancient Near East for people to cut into their flesh and to rub into it or to get tattoos as part of mourning practices. So this is one of those sources that then turns into Jews don't get tattoos, which then mistakenly gets turned into if you have a tattoo, you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Not true. That is a fiction. They do not scan your body and go, oh, you had a tattoo, bye. But it is a thing that people have heard because there is an emphasis in Rabbinic Judaism on the body staying intact. So we also get this with organ donation, that there's a mistaken belief among many people that you're not supposed to donate organs because you won't be able to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Also untrue. There are Orthodox rabbis who spend an awful lot of time jumping up and down and saying, no, 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 you should donate organs. Saving people's lives is much more important. And anyway, we're not going to stop you from being buried in a Jewish cemetery if you donated a kidney. Like, that's just not, that's not a thing, but people mistakenly believe it to be. Full calendar starts with Passover, doesn't use the word Pesach. It uses Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is one of these sources that makes scholars think that the Feast of Unleavened Bread was one thing, Pesach was another, and at some point they got squished together because they happened around the same time. Because you would expect a big calendar that talks about how you do sacrifices to also talk about doing the Pesach sacrifice when it talks about Passover. And that doesn't happen here. We just get the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Every major holiday is described as a Shabbat. So these are all considered Shabbat. Passover and Sukkot are really made to be parallel. When you read these texts, you kind of realize, oh, they're each 7 days long. They each occur start right around the full moon of their month. They are each kind of half-year marks. So Pesach occurs at the middle of the first month. Sukkot occurs in the middle of the 7th month. So you have a calendar that's actually dominated by two major holidays on half-year cycles with each other, where you take 7 days and you do this holiday. And all of the other holidays in between are a day. So we kind of lose track of this living in modern America, where we are kind of the inheritors of a rabbinic tradition that says, well, really only the first and the last day, or maybe the first two and the last two, depending on how you observe, but those days in the middle, those are regular days. Well, that's not what the Torah says. So the Torah really does set up this kind of cycle of 6 months at a time with major holidays punctuating the calendar, whereas we think the Jewish calendar starts on Rosh Hashanah. That's just how we treat it, because our frame of reference has shifted a lot since 650 BCE, or whenever this was written. We actually have the lulav and the etrog pretty well described. So Sukkot has this, you take fruit and you take these branches and you shake them. This is one of the oldest things we know about from Jewish religion. 2,650 years ago, give or take. So we know they were doing some kind of lulav and etrog thing. They don't use the word etrog. They just say pre-Eitz Hadar. So Jewish Publication Society says it's a Hadar tree. Hadar just means beautiful. But pre-Eitz Hadar, fruit of a goodly tree. We don't know what it was they were using. Probably pomegranate. But maybe figs. You know, we don't really know what they were using. And then all of this stuff is the lulav as we know it. So this part's really pretty old. Note that they have not said, oh, it's for a rain dance. I did that when we celebrated Sukkot, but the Torah does not say, oh, it's a rain dance. The Torah says, oh, you're supposed to gather at the tabernacle and do this, right? So it's taking these pagan customs and using them to get people to follow the rules that it has. The Haftarah for this one is Ezekiel 44, 15 through 31, which follows most of the rules from Leviticus 21 and 22 governing what priests do. Ezekiel identifies himself as being a priest in the temple. And then he has this. But the Levitical priests descended from Zadok, whom generally we're not familiar with, right? He's somebody we talk about every day. Zadok, right? You walk around. Oh, it's Zadok. So Ezekiel somehow decided, or is the inheritor of a tradition that says that there is a specific high priest who is the only legitimate ancestor for priests to serve in the temple. And if you're not an heir of this high priest, you are not allowed to function as a temple priest. And the high priest is Zadok. Zadok was the first high priest of Solomon's temple, according to 1 Kings. So Ezekiel is essentially saying, I have this tradition that says that you've got to be from his line in order to really be a priest in the temple. And if you're not, you don't get to serve. You can go live in the Levitical cities and you can do all kinds of other things, but you're not going to be sacrificing animals in the temple. Not your job. You're from the wrong family line. Ezekiel and Leviticus are kind of tightly tied. They preserve a lot of the same rules, and then there are these weird deviations that Ezekiel has. And this is one of them. So the book of Leviticus never says anywhere, these are the people that you need to be descended from, but Ezekiel has this tradition somehow. And Ezekiel's tradition is taken to be authoritative. So when you read late antique Jewish literature, things in the Dead Sea Scrolls, things in the New Testament, everybody thinks you have to be a priest from this line. So whatever tradition it was that Ezekiel had that's different from Leviticus was persuasive. And we don't really know how that happened, but it did. Okay, so that's 2. The third one is BEHAR, BECHUKOTAI. This finishes Leviticus for us, so we can have a party that Leviticus is done. About half of this is holiness code. So everything through Leviticus 26 is holiness code. Chapter 27 is its own thing. So BEHAR, BECHUKOTAI, another double portion due to the non-leap year thing that we have right now. BEHAR is the 5th word. Okay, we're going to see this formula via Ber Adonai el Moshe, blah, 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 blah. So we need something that distinguishes it. And this time, what distinguishes it is BEHAR Sinai, at Mount Sinai. BECHUKOTAI is a 2nd word. And finally, we get a distinguishing word. Im BECHUKOTAI telchu, if you walk in my statutes. So BECHUKOTAI is in my statutes. Again, these words don't tell you much, but these parshiot were defined before there were verse and chapter numbers formalized. Our verse and chapter numbers are as much Christian as they are Jewish. So when they defined these parshiot, they weren't working on verse and chapters and verses. They were working by, oh, we know where this starts and stops based on the word at the beginning and a word at the end, and that's how we know. So when you read midrashic literature, rabbinic literature, very often they will not say at Numbers 1:5, they will just say, it happens in Parshat Bamidbar, blah, 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 blah. They just don't have chapters and verses. And if you look at a Torah scroll, you will not find chapters and verses. You will find a bunch of white space between these Torah portions, however. And that's how you kind of navigate through the scroll. Why combine them? We finish Leviticus. It's a really practical thing. We're done. If you didn't do this, you'd have to combine BECHUKOTAI with the thing that came after it, which is the book of Numbers. I don't want to do that. That's not a clean division. So we slap these two together. From a public reading perspective, if you are just going to finish Leviticus in public, and that's the idea behind the Torah reading cycle. BECHUKOTAI is a clean restatement of the rationale for all the rules. If you follow the rules, you'll prosper in your land, you'll be fine, and nothing bad will happen to you. And if you don't follow the rules, I'm kicking you out. Or rather, the land will spew you out, is usually how the language goes. The first half of BECHUKOTAI is the end of the Holiness Code, and then we get this chapter 27, and this chapter 27 is its own kind of thing. So we'll talk about what's in there. BEHAR has the sabbatical years and the Jubilee years, right? So every 7 years, you release people and things revert back. Slaves are supposed to be released every 7 years on the sabbatical year. Debts are supposed to be forgiven in some way. You're not supposed to make any more loans. You're supposed to let the land lie fallow for a year. The land gets a rest. And then you have the Jubilee year. Shemitah is this word that means release, and this is release from obligations, complete reordering of who owns land. So land is supposed to, in most cases, revert to the family that originally owned it in the Jubilee year. So Jubilee is from Latin. The Hebrew word is just Yovel. What you do with an indentured or enslaved Israelite. So Israelites are not supposed to be permanent slaves. They're not supposed to be servants permanently because they are not servants to anybody but the God who took them out of Egypt. Right? That's the rationale that the Torah portion has. So an Israelite can be redeemed from a resident alien who's living among the Israelites. People aren't allowed to own Israelites permanently, is the basic idea. So the people that you can own as slaves permanently are resident aliens, not Israelites. There is a procedure in the book of Deuteronomy for if the person wants to stay. That's not really what's in this section. So we kind of know, sometimes you may have heard of this rule where if somebody says, "Oh, but I really like my master and I want to stay," okay, so you're supposed to stand against a post, and then they get an awl and they put a hole through your ear. That's not us. This is Deuteronomy. That's talking about that. I know. Joyce said, "Wait, a hole, like somebody puts a hole through your ear?" That's what they said you were supposed to do, to mark somebody as permanently a slave who was also an Israelite. And if you aren't able to redeem this person, so you are supposed to kind of pay off the debt. That's how you redeem somebody who's an Israelite slave. If you can't pay off the debt, when the Jubilee year comes, that person and his offspring are supposed to be released. So eventually, everybody's kind of let out. It is really worth saying here, there is no evidence at all that this Jubilee year thing ever happened. This may be almost entirely imaginary or aspirational or something that was written and then the Babylonian exile happened and it could never be followed through on. We don't really know, but there's no indication that this happened. And 11 of the 12 tribes that this would be talking about, if you think this was written around the year 650, 11 of the 12 tribes that this would have applied to don't exist anymore. So you don't really have to follow through because there's nobody to follow through on. The Assyrians own all of the stuff to the north. And I have to tell you, in the kingdom of Judah, all that was left, nobody wants to own the land there because it's good for sheep. It's not great if you want to grow fields of wheat. It's mostly not agricultural land. So people aren't going to fight over it as much. So nobody had to follow through on this. But there's no evidence it ever happened, right? So you would expect to see inscriptions that say in the Jubilee year, blah, 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 blah. We don't have any of that. So this is probably honored in the breach. So that's BEHAR. BECHUKOTAI restates why you're supposed to follow the holiness code. You'll get spewed out of the land. This helps us know when this was written. Because why would anybody write, oh, you'll be kicked out of the land if you don't follow the rules, unless people had already been kicked out of the land and you were looking for an explanation for why that happened. So this is the explanation. You didn't follow the rules, you were evicted. Then we have this last chapter of Leviticus 27. It's not part of the holiness code. It's just hanging out there at the end to talk about some really like tachlis stuff for how you run a sacrificial cult. And it's okay when you're going to dedicate property to the priests in the temple. How do you do that? And if you're not going to give something like your firstborn child, you're not actually going to sacrifice your firstborn child. So now we have to figure out what the monetary value is. You live too far away from the temple and you want to provide a cow. Here's how you figure out the value of the cow you're going to give to the temple. So this is just really practical administrative stuff. I guess they felt like it didn't belong anywhere but the end of Leviticus. You need administrative rules someplace, I guess. The Haftarah is from Jeremiah. If you've read Jeremiah, Jeremiah is like a super depressing guy because he's living during the time when the Babylonians are taking the Judeans out of Jerusalem. So he's living through this 10-year period where the Babylonian exile hasn't happened yet, but it's happening in drips and drabs. And he is, again, they've latched onto what's in Leviticus 26, the consequences for not following the rules, because that's what Jeremiah is all about. There are rules, you didn't follow them, there are consequences, you're going to get expelled. So you will forfeit by your own act the inheritance I've given you. I will make you a slave to your enemies in a land you have never known. Jeremiah, if you assume Jeremiah wrote this himself while he is supposed to have lived, he's actually watching priests and nobles being packed up and shipped off to Babylon. So there's this, the Babylonian exile is in like 586, 587, but in 596 is when the Babylonians really conquer the place and they start to pull leadership out. They take the king, they pick a new king, they take that king out, they start to move priests out, they start to move administrators out and disperse them throughout the Babylonian Empire. So this is Jeremiah watching this. Jeremiah is also known as a prophet of consolation because this is all this horrible stuff has happened and it is happening and you deserve every single bit of it, but also it'll be better later. So, but the Jeremiad, if you've ever encountered the word Jeremiad, right, Jeremiah, but you drop the H, you put a D, comes from Jeremiah being a hellfire kind of a guy. So, woe betide to you. That's Jeremiah. Okay, so this is the Torah portion that just happened this last Saturday, Bamidbar. You'll hear people call it Bamidbar. We'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about it here. So the Torah says, Vaydaber Moshe Bamidbar Sinai, in the wilderness of Sinai, but it's ba. You'll see it as Bamidbar because people decide that the should be there. It's Bamidbar. And the whole book is called Numbers because it starts with a census. So most of this is a census. Actually, most of this is 3 censuses. So chapter 1 is a census of everybody but the Levites. And we get 603,550 men age 20 or up who are capable of serving as soldiers. That's the population according to the book of Numbers at this point. So we're about ready to leave Mount Sinai, and this is the population. if you had all of these people and the accompanying women, children, elderly people, people who were just not physically in good enough shape to serve in the military, and then all the priests that they say are going to exist farther down in a couple of chapters down. If you had all of these people, basically you would have emptied Egypt. There's not that many people living back then. So we don't know where to get these numbers from, but these numbers really probably can't be realistic. It is bizarrely precise, however, for a text that might want to just say, there were 600,000 people. Like, this is how'd you get this number? We don't really know how they got this number. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 says, okay, and here's the layout for the camp. So when they encamp, these tribes are in the north, these tribes are in the south, the east, the west, and these are their numbers. So it again repeats the population numbers. So you can see diagrams of this depending on what Tanakh you buy. Some of them will have a marginal diagram that sort of shows the pattern of the camp, particularly really Orthodox ones. The Art Scroll one almost always has this as a footnote somewhere. Gives us the numbers again, but then tells you what order everybody was in around the tabernacle in the wilderness. That's the imaginary 600,000 soldiers. This is the pattern that they supposedly would have been in. And then chapter 3, remember at the beginning we said, okay, you're not allowed to count the Levites. Chapter 3, Moses is told, okay, count the Levites, but not in exactly the same way that you counted all of these other people. Because what you're supposed to do is find all the Levites who are 1 month or older and who are male. And those are the people that you're going to count as Levites. So we've already got a different counting system. It's every male older than a month, as opposed to every male who's 20 years or older and can hold a spear. And firstborn Levite sons are supposed to be redeemed. The idea being, well, they were supposed to just be handed over to the tabernacle for service, but you can kind of buy them out. We continue to do this in some Jewish communities. This is called Pidyon Haben, redemption of the firstborn son, where you give a donation for your firstborn son to the congregation and you've like magically redeemed them from a temple that doesn't exist. I mean, that's what the law is supposed to be doing here. Chapter 4 has another census of men aged 30 to 50 who belong to a specific family, the Levite family of Kohath. Their job is going to be to transport the tabernacle's structure. So the wooden beams that hold up the tent and the skins that make the tent and all of the vessels and things that you use, the altar and all of the stuff that you use to make sacrifices work. Their job is to transport it. Their job is not to touch it. They transport it. So the priests are supposed to pack it all up, and then the family of Kohath is supposed to come with whatever beasts of burden they're using to pull things, and their job is to make sure that the transportation happens when they're age 30 to 50. They're actually not supposed to watch the packing happen. The text actually says if they watch the packing happen, they'll die. So got to stay back and let the priests do their thing. They'll take care of it, but your job is to drive the carts. So there's a story of one of the Kohathite priests, and he is one of the Kohathite Levites, and he is driving the cart that is carrying the ark. And the ark seems like it's getting unsteady, and he reaches back and he touches it, and he's instantly killed. That's this family. We don't even know where the Ark of the Covenant is. You do have to wonder if you're not supposed to touch the Ark, and then you watch Indiana Jones and they somehow are able to take the lid off How did that work? They got to use poles to carry it, but the lid comes off somehow. I don't. Okay, we're not going to go too far into it. It's a plot hole. The Haftarah for this one is Hosea chapter 2, verses 1 through 22. It's really the whole chapter with a few verses left off. And the tie is the census thing. The number of the people of Israel shall be like that of the sands of the sea, which cannot be counted or measured. Doing a census is, in the Tanakh, considered to be bad. So it's ordered once in Numbers. When David decides to do a census for tax purposes, bad things happen. He's punished for having a census. So you're not supposed to do a census. Therefore, this takes on a little different meaning, right? You're not supposed to count them. Just have faith that they're the size, that they are as many as the sands of the sea. It gets a little more depressing because Hosea is basically talking about how bad everybody is. You see a theme in the prophets. You people are bad. That's kind of the theme in the prophets. Hosea does this in very interesting ways. Hosea generates all kinds of names that he's supposed to name his children. And the names of his children are supposed to be things like born in adultery. This is just particular to Hosea. It's like, this is the literary form that Hosea kind of takes on. But what's notable about this passage is how it ends. So the way it ends is with verses that are often used at weddings, and for people who put on tefillin every day, they recite these verses specifically when they are wrapping the tefillin strap around their fingers. And it says, I will espouse you forever, bind you to me forever, with righteousness and justice, and with goodness and mercy, and with faithfulness, and you shall be devoted to the Lord. So this is ve'eras tichli le'olam, ve'eras tichli betzedek u'v'chesed u'rachmat, and they're wrapping the leather around their fingers like it's a wedding band. That's the imagery that's happening when someone is putting on tefillin and reciting this. So putting on tefillin is a multi-step process. There's, you put it on here and you put it on here and there's a blessing, and then you wrap it around and there's another blessing, and then you wrap it around your hand, and as you're finishing up, you recite these verses as part of it. So this is Hosea. This is where that passage comes from. Bonus. I know you're very excited for all of this bonus, which is the Torah portions for Shavuot. First day of Shavuot has a set of Torah verses that are read. Second day has a set of verses. Numbers is always read on Shavuot because this is the commandment for doing Shavuot is in the book of Numbers. So on the major holidays, the traditional Torah reading cycle pulls stuff out that you would have already read or would read in the future. So for Shavuot, you get the 10 Commandments again at Sinai. So Exodus would have been read months ago, but we get the 10 Commandments again because Shavuot, according to the rabbis, is the time when the 10 Commandments were given at Sinai. They have no proof for this, by the way. There's nothing that says, oh, well, on the, you know, what is this? This is almost this is like the 29th day of the second month of the Israelite calendar. They got all these commandments. We have no idea. But they find subtle words and they slap them together and they think they've got something. So it includes the giving the 10 Commandments at Sinai, one of the sets of the rules for how you do Shavuot. And then you get a restatement from Deuteronomy of all of these rules that we had already gotten in Leviticus a couple of weeks ago. You get a restatement of the sabbatical year and tithing and poor relief and redemption for people from indenture and the holiday calendar. Deuteronomy doesn't include a Jubilee year. So we already have a mismatch in the text of the Torah in these two places, but it does give you the big pilgrimage holidays. So Deuteronomy doesn't actually seem to talk too much about Rosh Hashanah. This is its calendar, or these pilgrimage holidays. This is what it wants to focus on. Because Shavuot is one of the 3 pilgrimage holidays, one of the 3 holidays that you are, in this time period, supposed to go up to the temple in Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice right there. And with in Shavuot's case, it's the wheat harvest. So winter wheat, you actually reap throughout the late spring. Here, it's the late spring. And Shavuot is when you've gotten the first of that and you're bringing it to the temple. Says Standing Again at Sinai. There's a book called Standing Again at Sinai that's actually about feminist biblical criticism. But this is one of the verses that gets read during the Torah readings in Shavuot. So this is Exodus 19:8. This verse is taken by the rabbis to mean we are agreeing unconditionally up front to the covenant with God, even though we don't know its contents. Everything he said, we'll do. Don't worry about it. Whatever it is, we're fine. And then there's a moment 9 verses later where the tradition says, well, actually, they decided that they didn't want to say that anymore because they just thought that about the written Torah. But once they heard about all the other stuff that they had to do, they said, oh, maybe not. And there's a very curious turn of phrase that led the rabbis to conclude that what happened at Sinai was the Israelites said, oh, yeah, we'll do it, until they saw the oral Torah, the other half of it. And then they had to be compelled. And the way in which they were compelled was that Mount Sinai was lifted off the ground and hovered over the Israelites. And they were told, you will accept or you're going to die right here, because I'm going to drop Sinai on you. At which point they said, yes, 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 of course we agree, because who wants to be squished? It's based on a sort of interesting reading of the word beneath. I guess we could talk about that differently. But that's sort of the idea of Shavuot is, this is the holiday, this is Man Matan Torah, the time of the giving of the Torah, which required some compulsion eventually, according to the rabbis, because the Israelites said, never mind, I don't want to do that. Okay, fine, here's this mountain. Now what do you think, right? I don't want to do that. And somebody holds a gun to your head. I've changed my mind. But that's how the Midrash actually frames this idea. Oh, they agreed until they voted for it until they voted against it. Was that John Kerry? I voted for it until I voted against it, something like that. That's really dredging up some American politics from a while ago, right? An additional reading, so there's the Book of Ruth, which is one of the 5 Megillot, 5 scrolls that are associated with different Jewish holidays. So we read the Megillah, right? When we say the Megillah, we usually mean the Book of Esther. So I sort of read the Megillah at the Purim party, right? And I sort of didn't, because I asked kids questions like, does this seem fair? Because of course the answer is no, this doesn't seem fair. The Book of Lamentations is associated with Tisha B'Av, so that'll be read in July or August. Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiastes is read on Sukkot because there's a time for everything. Song of Songs is read during Passover because it's supposedly the relationship of the Jewish people and God. And then Shavuot is read, Ruth is read on Shavuot. So Ami says, we have to quit, but Whoever has not tasted my late mother's cheesecake from Shavuot does not know what Shavuot is all about. Dairy is a thing that you eat on Shavuot. I do not understand why, when so many Jews are lactose intolerant, dairy has become the thing to eat on Shavuot, particularly in the pre-lactate days, but it is. I have heard the story that cheese blintzes look kind of like Torah scrolls, and that's why. You could just put fruit in the blintzes. It doesn't have to be cheese. So Ruth is also read on Shavuot, usually in the afternoons. It's not something that's a main reading. And Ruth tells the story of Ruth and Naomi and Ruth's conversion story. And I kind of put it in quotes because what she does is she marries an Israelite. Actually, twice. She marries an Israelite twice. It gets tied to Shavuot in part because a lot of this takes place at the time of the wheat harvest, which is when Shavuot takes place, but also because this is sort of Ruth accepting the Torah. That's the kind of the traditional Jewish perspective on this, is Ruth is accepting the Torah, so this is a nice tie seasonally as well. If you're learning biblical Hebrew, first year biblical Hebrew in college or in high school or as an adult in an adult ed program, Ruth is almost always the first biblical book you read because the Hebrew is really straightforward. And unlike most other biblical books, it has feminine plurals, which you don't see very much anywhere else. So biblical Hebrew teachers love it because it's like, it's like algebra. You learn algebra in high school and you go, what am I going to use this for? You learn the feminine plural in Hebrew and you go, what am I going to use this for? And the answer is, well, we've got this one book where you're going to use it. Kind of like teachers say, oh, well, you're going to use geometry to figure out the hypotenuse someday. Yes, I might do that. You're right. Rarely when I don't have a tape measure. So this is we need to teach you the feminine plurals. And Ruth has a lot of those because Ruth is a story about women, not really about guys. So it has that grammar. Otherwise, you never use the feminine plural. There's one other time. It's in Numbers, but it's later in Numbers. So I guess when we get there, I'll point out, oh, there's feminine plurals here too. Not that it matters that much. But this is the tie of Ruth to Shavuot, is when it takes place and the story behind it. It is worth noting that despite all of this, Ruth is actually a pretty subversive book. Ruth is a Moabite, and the Torah says that Moabites can't become Israelites. And Ruth becomes an Israelite, despite being a Moabite. So this is sort of a countercultural book, a book in response to kind of the dominant thread in the Torah that says Moabites can't become Israelites. And it's a response, it's thought to be a response to what's in the book of Ezra, where Ezra, the scribe who's writing the Torah, kind of compiling the Torah, is often attributed to him directly. Ezra tells all of the men living in Judea to cast out their foreign wives. And this is thought to be roughly contemporary to that as no, we're not going to do that. We don't have to. Look, even Moabites can be Israelites, right? So it's this kind of subversive piece of literature. There's at least the hypothesis that it was written by a woman. We can't really know any of that stuff, I think, particularly with biblical Hebrew. It is very straightforward biblical Hebrew, which is why it gets taught in first year biblical Hebrew, because you can read it with not too much difficulty. I say, having taught people to read it with a lot of difficulty in the past. So I'm telling you what I was told. I'm also telling you it's not all that easy. And that's it. That's the wrap up. That's all the Torah that's fit to print for the month of May. Questions?
I have questions.
Anybody still awake? Okay, Joyce.
So maybe I misheard you, because you were talking about Adar and leap year and all that. First of all, I have two questions about that. how often do they throw in that extra month?
Um,
I'm just curious.
my brain doesn't remember it in full, but there are, it usually turns out that there are more leap months than not.
Wikipedia explains it.
Okay.
It's every so often.
It's every so often, right. And secondly, you said they picked Adar in part because there aren't major holidays, but didn't you also say Purim is in the...
So we need to think about what a major holiday is. A major holiday is something that has to be observed as a Shabbat, and that's not Purim.
Oh, so it doesn't count.
Same deal with Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not observed as a Shabbat, therefore not a major holiday.
Therefore not a major holiday. Okay, and secondly, I just wanted to make the observation that I thought it was interesting where you talked about one of the rules being that you're not allowed to consume blood, and then the religion that came after it is all about consuming someone's blood or what is representing their blood.
Yeah.
Just thought that was interesting.
There's some amount of irony. The thought is that this is actually from a Greco-Roman mystery cult called Mithraism, which talks about the idea of partaking in the blood of Mithra, who is I want to say Persian bull god or something like that. It's been how old am I? It's been 22 years since I actually studied Mithraism in any depth. So my memory is fuzzy, but my recollection is that there's sort of a symbolic blood sort of thing happening.
Okay. And thanks for the thing about tattoos. That was very interesting. I always wondered where that came from.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. Just a misunderstanding.
I just looked it up. So leap years are 7 out of every 19 years. That's a lot.
Yep.
Wow.
So I once mentioned this to my son-in-law, who's really very knowledgeable about geology, and he immediately perked up. He said, that's the tidal cycle. In other words, that's what, if you do it that way, 19 years later, the sun and the moon will be in the same place that they were 19 years earlier. That, you know, and it's really very accurate. 7 out of 19 extra, I guess, you know, lunar months.
Honestly, I just buy a book. There's a, so it sounds so simple. There's a book that's put together by an Orthodox Jewish publishing company that's like, I think it's called something like, I don't have it near me, the 100 Years Rabbi's Calendar or something.
Okay.
So you just know 100 years out, it tells you what year it's good through, right? It's like a calendar. And it tells you, oh, you know, in the year 2080, this is the leap months that are going to be there.
Right.
And it's already been calculated out. So
wow.
There is that link that I had that is designed for software developers to be able to calculate out these, have an algorithm that calculated out, and it's quite complete. But it does not mention the tidal cycle.
No, but you understand that that's how the solar and the lunar cycles realign once every 19 years.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And that's why it worked, you know, and somebody had figured out, I assume it was the Babylonians who figured it out, and that the Hebrews picked it up from them. That's my assumption.
That's a pretty good assumption, right? Because the original biblical calendar doesn't even have months exactly. It just sort of says Passover happens in the spring.
Right.
And it's very indistinct about all of this. So
the Babylonians were really very knowledgeable astronomers who were able to predict eclipses. The Hebrews, not so much.
No, not so much. And the Babylonians apparently were actually able to figure out, pi in a more precise way than the Greeks. They had their own kind of mathematical structure that was much more practical than Euclidean geometry was for construction purposes, which is how you get the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, assuming they existed. We shouldn't assume those existed, right? Because that's like the 7 wonders of the ancient world, according to Herodotus, who was wrong a lot. I think it's fair to say he was wrong a lot.
Jeremy?
Yes.
Back when you were talking about the Book of Job, you did an interesting comparison to other Near Eastern literature on similar themes. So the question occurred to me about the holiness code that you talked about. Are there extant references to other holiness codes in the Near East? And if so, does this one mark any kind of departure because of its ethical content, or how would you do the comparison, if there's a comparison to be made?
So we don't have, the problem becomes that you don't have mostly documents from the ancient Near East that are as long as the Torah, or even that are as long as Leviticus or as long as the Holiness Code, because they didn't use papyrus or parchment, they used clay tablets, which is really actually hard to write on. You know, you get these little wedges, and the ideal way of writing on those was actually a thing that was like the size of your palm that you would then turn around and get the wedges on. So we have chunks of priestly conduct codes. They're not quite as obsessive about detail as Israelite ones are, because they're not as worried about one God who's going to strike everything down. So some of your impulse for being really, really, really careful isn't as present. The ethical stuff, there's lots of that around. So we're not, Israelite law isn't terribly unique in having some of the ethical and the sexual things that are talked about. There's lots of parallels for that. Just like, so we'll have stuff like the Code of Hammurabi that is actually pretty close to Israelite law. There's lots and lots and lots of legal documents out there. That's actually the primary stuff that we have from the ancient Near East are legal documents, because the function of scribes was commerce. So we've got contracts, and we've got letters, and we've got legal codes, and we actually, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh and all of these, you know, the things that are just like the flood narrative or whatever, that's a real minority of the literature, just because people wrote on clay tablets these legal things, and that's what survived. But the detail obsessiveness isn't quite there in the same way. It's there sometimes, but it's not as thoroughgoing. And it never really gets to the point of the entire nation is holy or unholy because one person screwed up this one thing. Other questions? Questions come up, let me know.
Yeah, I might want, you're going to send the slides. I would love to. Yeah, I would love to. I know that I had another question, but I couldn't remember it.
Yeah, I will send the slides.
Okay, good.
Okay.
All right. See
Thanks,
y'all
everyone.
later.
Good night.
Thanks very much.